Hi, everyone. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com. And today we're with the Dawn Patrol. We're going to start an early morning series on Christianity. But that said, sometimes we're going to talk about when both Christians and Muslims in a debate have made some errors. And the particular debate we're going to focus on today is on the Modern Day Debate channel with James Kuntz. And it featured Daniel Haqiqatjou as the Muslim and Andrew Wilson as the Christian. And in this debate, I witnessed what we would call the ecological fallacy. And you're going to learn exactly what that is in a moment. So you've come to the right place. So the ecological fallacy was committed on both sides by Daniel Haqiqatjou and by Andrew Wilson. And so let's listen. And here we go. We'll listen to part of the debate. And then I'm going to tell you what the flaws were on both sides. Flaws in reasoning, flaws in assumptions. Here we go. Now, why can I do this? Let me just preface this. I hold a PhD in business administration from an AACSB accredited school. I'm an associate dean in a college of business, and I teach at the doctoral level a class on research methodology. And so I think I am qualified to make this discussion. So here we go.
Muslim and Christians generally subscribe to traditional values. In fact, all humans, due to biology, inherently value things like belief in a creator, marriage, family, and community. So let's see whether Islam or Christianity is better at promoting these things in society using the abundance of empirical data available. Let's start with a bird's eye view using the World Values Survey, a global project measuring beliefs, values, and cultural changes in over 100 countries. Their World Cultural Map from 2023 groups countries by religion. Protestant European countries are yellow, Orthodox is red, European Catholics are green, Latin America in light blue, and Islamic countries in gray. On the x-axis, countries that value individual self-expression and autonomy are further right on the graph. On the y-axis, countries that are more secular or higher up. The ones that have more traditional values are lower. So you can see in the bottom left, there are the Islamic countries that are more traditional, whereas the Christian countries are more secular.
And he is correct about that. But let's talk about exactly what this map is showing you. And so this is from the World Values Surveys. I'm very familiar with that because I have published studies on that. In fact, you can find the most recent one in 2022 in Ethics and Behavior, where I distinguished differences between generations in ethical values. But I digress. On this particular map, what you're going to see is the latest wave of the World Values Surveys, meaning that since 1981, they've been collecting waves of data and they've identified values all around the world and they've surveyed people in multiple countries. And so you can see at the bottom left, as Daniel pointed out, the African Islamic group is trending towards more traditional values. You can see countries like Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, and Libya, Ghana, other countries in that, Qatar, Zimbabwe. And then you can see up on the far right corner on the top, you see Protestant Europe. So you must distinguish something here because Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe are a little bit different, and even Orthodox Europe. So as Andrew comes into this debate, he comes in with an Orthodox lens. And so you see the Orthodox here are trending a little bit closer to the traditional values. The Catholics are sort of in the middle and the Protestants are on the right, meaning that the Protestants tend to focus more on what the study calls self-expression values. In other words, it's focused more on the self and self-expression. If you want to look at Maslow's hierarchy, the idea is self-actualization. And so according to Maslow's hierarchy, once you get past the survival idea where you're just paying for your food and your security and your shelter, you can advance into the self-expression mode or the self-actualization mode. And that's where you see Protestant Europe. They're very wealthy, and a lot of them have moved away from Protestantism and into atheism. And that's what Daniel points out correctly in this particular video. So let's keep going.
Value individual autonomy. How about belief in God? Muslim countries show higher religiosity and belief in God than Christian ones. For example, Pew Research asked people in different countries if they believe in God. For nearly all the Muslim countries, the number was 100%, to such an extent that Pew concluded that nearly all Muslims surveyed believe in God.
Now, what he also has in this that he didn't point out, but we might want to point out at the bottom, is you can see in the United States, 96% of people believe in God, percent of people who say they believe in God. And so that's a pretty high percentage. And so you can see that. Now, it's a little bit lower in places like Germany. It says 76%. UK, it says 85%. Spain says 86%. So it's lower in some countries. But then you have other countries like Catholic South America, where you see Peru is 99%, Colombia is 100%. And so you can kind of cherry pick here, but you might want to at least include some of the factual information on Christian percentages and people who believe in God. So here we go.
Pew data set shows Muslim countries, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, at the top of global belief rankings, while Christian countries are split, with Kenya, Ghana, and the Philippines high, but the US, Spain, and France low. What about religiosity? On this map, all Muslim countries are dark purple, showing the largest share of religious followers. Christian countries, except Latin America, are much lower, like the US, Europe, and Russia. Pew studied how important religion is to people's lives. And for Muslim countries, they're dark yellow, indicating 80 to 100% of people saying religion is very important to them. While
Notice what's kind of sad here is you can see that a lot of people in Europe, a lot of these countries in Europe tend to be lower in this particular scale. So this idea where they follow a religion is very low in places like China, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Europe, like the Nordic countries and Western Europe. And so you can see that that is a trend. But in the United States, we still are holding out a little bit of hope here. We have people believing in religion. But I haven't gotten to the fallacies yet. Stay
Most
tuned.
Christian countries are much lower in gray and blue. The 2024 Integrated Values Survey confirms this. In majority Muslim countries like Indonesia and Egypt, over 97% say religion is very important, whereas in Christian countries like Mexico, the US, Russia, and Germany, religion matters far less. Another key metric is religious switching. Pew shows Christianity in red has the largest net loss of followers, while Islam in green has the highest net gain from conversions.
This is correct. He has found correct data here, and it's an unfortunate thing. We have noticed that trend. In fact, since the late 1940s in the United States, we had a tremendous amount of people who were church-going believers, who were going to church every Sunday. And today, as we speak, 2025, unfortunately, those numbers are very low. And so the things that Daniel's pointing out here are correct. And so he's basically talking to bigger trends. Now, where it gets interesting is the counter here from Andrew. And so I'm going to zoom ahead here to listen to what Andrew's main argument was. And this is where I actually saw some of the flaws and also some of the pushback from Daniel on this. So let's take a look.
The second is that he's an above average debater, but he ain't quite God tier. See, if I were Daniel and fighting from his worldview, I'd point out Christianity is fractured and weak, that Christianity is totally incapable of fighting back against the degeneracy of our time. Its impotence has led to social categories of degeneracy at levels nobody could have predicted, especially with the advent of the internet. I would point out Muslim societies don't work that way, that Muslims have feminism and degens under control, that everything in modern day Christians in the West are fighting for against degeneracy, Islam has already achieved in their lands.
That's where, not with Daniel here, but actually, yes, with Daniel. One of the things that I see as a flaw is the overgeneralization of the term Christian. Because since the 1500s, there have been a lot of denominations of Christianity. As you know, for 1500 years, actually for the first 1054, up until the year 1054, the Catholic Church was dominant. And as Andrew would say, it was the Orthodox Church dominant. But basically, those two churches, the East and the West, split in 1054. And the Orthodox went one way and the Catholics went the other way. And then, as you know, the Protestant Reformation came about in 1517, started on October 31st by Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, with his 95 Theses, talked about what he considered some of the flaws of the Catholic Church. And since then, there have been thousands of denominations. And so there are multiple views within Christianity. There are definitely some more liberal views. In fact, as Daniel points out in this debate, you can go into some churches, some denominations that are hinging towards the left, and you'll see pride flags, you'll see all kinds of things in those churches. But then when you stick to the conservative churches, which tend to be more like the Catholic churches and the Baptist churches, you're not going to see the leftist sort of views. You're not going to see people promoting gay marriage or anything else because they promote biblical values. What Jesus said, he said, for example, marriage is between one man and one woman. And if you go to the Catholic Church, you're going to find that Catholics have never promoted things like abortion. Catholics have never been behind that. In fact, going all the way back to the Didache in the first century, written by the apostles, we see the condemnation of abortion. Of course, we also see that in the Ten Commandments with thou shalt not kill, but we see it in the Didache. And the Catholics have always felt that. And Catholics have never affirmed some of the more what they call modernist views. And so, to be fair to Christians, you have to distinguish the denominations. Just like to be fair to Muslims, you would want to distinguish the Shiites from the Sunnis. But I digress. Let's keep going.
That's what I would do if I were Daniel. When talking about which is better for society, Islam or Christianity, this becomes a powerful argument. But I'd go a step further if I were Daniel. I'd also say my opponent will argue like an atheist progressive. That Andrew Wilson, the guy who promotes anti-feminist and egalitarian doctrine, is going to sit up here and act like an egalitarian progressive and cry about Islam being mean to the women and cry about Islam not being very nice to the gays. Well, you were fucking wrong. Sadly for Daniel, while this tactic would normally be effective against a sewing circle Christian, I'm not part of that cast, sir. Now, let me get into my argument for why Christianity makes better societies than Islam, and it's pretty simple. Islamic societies breed an inbred population. Next slide, please. Muslim inbreeding has been occurring at a high rate for about 1,400 years since the early Islamic period, encompassing most of the land still occupied by Islam today. It spread from the 8th to the 15th century, moved into Persia, North Africa, South Asia, where it remains and has created some of the dumbest fucking human beings on planet Earth.
Stay with me here because I have to show you what is actually flawed in this argument. And though I do agree with Andrew that, yes, there is some level of inbreeding in these different countries, the extension to all Muslims into IQ is flawed. And that's what we're going to get into.
The most common type of inbreeding is first cousin marriage. The rates of first cousin marriage in comparison to Christian nations is staggeringly high, even in comparison to regions occupied by Arab Christians. When a nation has both Christians and Muslims, Muslims are often double or higher than Christians. Example, India, Lebanon. Next slide, please. Muslim inbreeding. Oh, sorry about that. Pakistan at 65%. 65%, meaning more likely than not, you're having sex with your cousin, and if you're not, you're the weird one. Okay? For the low IQ members of MDD, that means these people are more likely than not having sex with their aunts or uncles' children. Saudi Arabia, 50 to 58%, with an average 76 IQ.
So you notice what's going on here. I just want to point this out because it's really important. Nobody has pointed this out as far as I can see. He is making a assumption. He's making an assumption here that because there's some inbreeding in these different countries, that their IQ is corresponding. He's basically saying because this, then therefore that. And in my field, that's talking about correlation without causation. It's a flaw. And so I'm gonna let this go for a second here, and then I'm gonna show you some slides and some factual information from a number of different studies that basically will give some true light on exactly what's going on here. And we'll talk about what the real factors are behind IQ differences between countries. I mean, certainly this is a small contributor, consanguinity. However, it's a small contributor. And you have to look at the facts. We have to drill down on the data to actually understand what's going on here. But let's just keep going for a second here, and then we'll go over to what is
Who would have thought it? UAE, 54%, 82 IQ. The crown jewel of the Arab world, you are more likely than not to be banging your first cousin. Iran, 40%, 80 IQ. Yemen, 45%, 62.9 IQ. Qatar, 30%, 80.8 IQ.
Okay, so we got that. Now let's take a listen. I've got some factual information I want to show you. So just to sum it up, what Daniel said here, he said Christianity in one point here, he said upheld its pre-modern norms of, or no, sorry, Daniel said this, Daniel. So this is the Muslim. Christianity upheld its pre-modern norms of slavery, female subordination, monarchy, punishments for blasphemy, executions for adultery. After the Enlightenment, Christians, now again, here's what Daniel's doing. He's grouping all Christians together, whether they are Catholics, Orthodox, people in different varying degrees of liberalism coming in from the Protestant denominations. He says Christians began reforming their religion to match secular values. Well, certainly some did. Yes, some did. Not all, Daniel. And that liberalizing process continues today with the acceptance of homosexuality, LGBT rights, and modern feminism. Even though he's a conservative, Andrew already accepts huge chunks of this liberal reform. And so that is Daniel. He's, again, extending the views of the most dominant denomination in the world, which is Catholicism, which has the most believers of all Christian denominations. He's extending the views of the Protestants and assuming that Catholics and others have also adopted these beliefs, any beliefs which are in alignment with the Bible. And that's actually just patently untrue. So Daniel generalizes his perceptions onto all Christians. The ecological fallacy, in case you don't know what that is, it occurs when you assume that something that may be true for a group, like Americans, must also be true for all individuals within that group, like Christians. Now, where I first heard this term coined was with Gert Hofstede. Now, Gert Hofstede is a researcher in international business. And what he did is he identified means, country level means in a number of different values, like power distance, individualism, etc. And what he's saying is that you can't assume that all of the people in a country that's considered highly individualistic at the mean level, meaning the mean score is high in individualism, like in the United States, you can't assume that various members, like drilling it all the way down to someone like me here in the United States, you can't assume that I'm necessarily individualistic because, of course, you have a mean score, but you have to also realize there's standard deviations. And so there are people who vary significantly from the mean, so you can't apply the top level. And so what that means is, like for Daniel, taking, assuming that some Christians, because some Christians, and maybe even the mean of Christians, maybe an average number of Christians support, for example, gay marriage, you can't assume that all Christians support gay marriage because some average, say 59% do support it. And so that's just something you want to pay attention to. So let's take a look at the next side. Now, here's where where Andrew has a flaw. Here's what Andrew says. Now, you heard what he says. This is the quote. You just heard it. Okay, for the low IQ members of MDD, that means these people are more likely than not having sex with their aunts or uncles' children. And he cites all of these different statistics. So basically, first he says the prevalence of people having sex with relatives. And then he points out to the IQ score. So he uses what we would call a univariate analysis. And that's where he's flawed. What's a univariate analysis? It's putting two variables together and assuming there's no other controls. In other words, assuming IQ is directly and perfectly correlated with the scores on the levels of cousin marriage. And that's flawed. You remember probably, if you followed the atheists, you remember Matt Dillahunty making that same thing. He used to always cite this particular study that talked about its levels of atheism in Europe and levels of happiness, and without looking at all of the other correlates of happiness, saying that atheism and happiness are correlated. I think that's what that study said. I could be wrong, but it was something like that. But basically, it's taking two factors. It's kind of also, just to give it another, just to understand this a little bit better, it's also when people say that they look at the gender pay gap and they say, oh, all around the world, the gender pay gap is about 15%, meaning that females are paid 85 cents on the dollar to the males. But however, they don't drill down on the gender pay gap. When the OECD collects that data, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, when they collect the data on the gender pay gap, they ignore the types of jobs that women tend to choose. A lot of times they're in more nurturing fields like education, K through 12 schools and that. And they ignore the average years work, the average hours work. They ignore all kinds of different factors that are super important to explaining pay. So in other words, they use a univariate analysis at the OECD level. And of course, politicians jump on that left and right. So what really is going on with the gender pay gap is if you actually add in all of the important variables that I just mentioned, plus more, as the pay scale study did, and even if you look at differences between the races on the pay, you're going to find that to the white man's dollar, Asian females and Asian males make $1.03 to the white man's dollar, whereas Black, Hispanic, and white females make 97, 98, 99 cents on the white man's dollar. And so once you factor in all of these really important factors, we get away from this 85 cents on the dollar, and we get to a span of 97 cents to $1.03 to the white man's dollar. So these little kind of facts explain why univariate analysis, which is what what Andrew has employed here, is flawed. And so it's pretty important to notice this kind of stuff, because if you don't analyze the information in a skeptical way, you're going to come up with flawed arguments. Now, how did Daniel respond to Andrew's argument about IQ and cousin marriage? Unfortunately, he coined the term IQ fetishists. And he talked about how he says IQ leads to atheism. Now, what's sad about that particular argument is that Daniel is assuming that if you study more, you're going to become an atheist. And that is exactly the opposite of what happens. In fact, when you get to the top of the mountain of education, which I have, I have a terminal degree. I've gotten to the top of the mountain of education. I've gotten as high as you can get. Although if I could get additional terminal degrees, then I would give you higher. But what I can say is once you get to the top of the mountain and the deeper you study and the more deep you go into purpose and meaning and all of the kind of important things in life, you discover God. God is at the top of the mountain. That's exactly what's there. And so the more studying you do, the more likely you are to find God. In fact, C.S. Lewis discovered that. C.S. Lewis was an atheist at the turn of the last century. Well, maybe he wasn't around the turn of the last century, but the beginning of the last century, he was an atheist. And he basically realized after deep study that he came to God. In fact, what he said is an atheist cannot be too careful about the books that he reads because he might end up being a Christian. It will find your way to God. The more you study, the more you will come closer to God. And that's why you find a lot of highly intelligent Christians out there. Now, here's what Daniel's basic thesis was, which was kind of sad. I felt bad for him when he said this. He said, low IQ societies are better in defending us against people like Peter Thiel and other atheists who have this demonic antichrist future that they're planning for us based on technology. Now, is he right about that? Is he right? Now, Daniel's very concerned about people like the Klaus Schwab types at the World Economic Forum. And we saw what they did. We saw what they did back in the 2020 year during COVID. They took advantage of that. And they basically said by 2030, no one's going to own anything and everybody's going to be happy. And I also, just like Daniel, I take the same thing. Daniel, I, and Andrew would hold hands and say, no, we don't want to see that. We definitely don't want to see people like Klaus Schwab, because when they say nobody's going to own anything, they lie. What they mean is no regular person, no middle-class person is going to own anything. Just a few at the top are going to be renting all of our places for us. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very concerned with the fact that home ownership is going later and later in the United States. I think you're about 40 years old now before people are buying their first homes. And that's terrible. It used to be in the 20s, but I digress. Anyway, so the idea is, yes, we're all concerned about people's move towards what they call transhumanism, the idea that you can play around with cells. And that actually speaks to something that Catholics have also always been against. Catholics are not for contraception. Catholics are also not for playing around with the embryos outside of the womb. Catholics have been against that since it came out, since people started doing that. So anyway, here we go. Now, what Andrew says is the mean IQ of the societies you produce are between 1 and 2 standard deviations lower than the average Christian nation. He said that Daniel wants to keep the world at 70 IQ. And he said, Daniel also probably wants to know, like in the United States, they won't allow you in the military if you have below an 85 IQ. Why is that? Well, it's because you would actually be a detriment. As a troop, you would be a detriment to your colleagues in the military if you have under an 85 IQ. You would actually hurt them because your IQ is so low. It's sad, unfortunately, some people do have very low IQs. What's interesting about that is there are a number of factors that contribute to IQ, and I'm going to talk about those that go beyond this idea of cousin marriage. Cousin marriage is a teeny little contributor, and I'm going to show you why. And I'm also going to point out a couple of other things. One is male and female differences in IQ, because in the Muslim faith, apparently, they seem to think that females have lower IQs than males. Now, certainly in some places where females have much lower education rates, well, yes, of course, you're going to see that play out. And I'll talk about that in just a minute, too. But what I want to say is the average IQ score worldwide is 100, okay? And males and females, the interesting thing is females, if you looked at the scale of the average IQ score, males tend to um, hover a little bit lower, meaning males tend to be at the extremes in very high IQ, but also very low IQ. And females tend to be more centered around the middle of that. More females are at the 100 score than males, but more males are at both ends of the IQ spectrum. So here are some other contributors to the IQ score. Male and female contributions to education. In many parts of the world, females are prohibited from attending school, definitely can't go on to get a secondary or even a tertiary education. It's terrible. The other reason why, when I mentioned before, the gender pay gap and Asian males and females making $1.03 to the white man's dollar here in the United States is because in the Asian culture and also in the Jewish cultures, there is a huge encouragement from parents to study, to tell the kids, study, study, study. It's a big thing over in places like China and Japan and South Korea, also in traditional, many Indian cultures, cultures within India. Also, we can see that coming in Jewish cultures. And it's something that other cultures should think about doing if they want their kids to do well in life. A lot of times that tends to relate to doing well in school, so long as they keep the Christian morality. Okay, you can do really well, as Daniel pointed out, in life. You could be financially very successful, but you could be completely dead inside as far as your belief system. And that's the sad thing. That is unfortunately a sad thing. Now, what am I saying about educational achievements in the Muslim faith? I have to point out some other facts. You know, Daniel went to Pew. I'll go to Pew. Here's what Pew says. And now this is a bigger contributor, I'm saying, to the IQ than this whole idea of cousin marriage. In North America, Muslims have 13.6 years on average of schooling. The average plus 25 Muslim population in 2010 was 1.8 million people in North America. In Europe, 21.6 million Muslims and 9.5 years of education. In the Middle East and North Africa, 5.9 average years of education, and there's 107.3 million people. In the Asia Pacific, 462.2 million people and only 5.9 years of education. In Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's 79.7 million people, there's 2.6 years. And globally, where there's 672.6 million people in 2010, 5.6 years of average education. So what it says here with Pew is nearly 4 in 10 or 36% Muslim adults still have no formal schooling at all. That includes 43% of all Muslim women and 30% of Muslim men. So it's a very small percentage. So this is a bigger contributor to the successes that Andrew's pointing out than this cousin marriage. And I'm going to drill into the cousin marriage thing with the meta-analytic study here in just a minute. So you're still in the right place. Stay tuned. Now, here is the interesting thing as well. Muslims do really well when they come into Christian countries. They do really well education-wise. And so look at this. In New Zealand, you can see right here in the dark green countries on the map, you can see the United States, North America particularly, Brazil, you've got Russia, you have China, you have New Zealand. You can see places like that where we see New Zealand, 14.2 years of average education, meaning that when Muslims go to another country, especially one that's very focused on education, as many Western countries are, they do really well. It's a good thing for Muslims to be in these countries, which might be one of the reasons why a lot of Muslims have come to other parts of the world, because they want to study and they do really well once they do. And so you can see where places that push education, Muslims really succeed quite well as far as studying. Now, here is going back to what Andrew says, the idea of inbreeding and cousin marriage. In the blue, you can see where the percentages are really high of cousin marriage. Now, does that mean that you can use the ecological fallacy as saying the average levels, say 60% here in places like Pakistan? You can take that and extend it to the average person in that society? No, the ecological fallacy would say, no, you can't do that because there's variation within cultures. So here is the percentages again, kind of repeating what Daniel said. And so we have pretty high percentages of people in certain countries, say 38% in Saudi Arabia, 61% Pakistan. It kind of ranges, but Daniel already acknowledged this. However, here's the application. Now, Andrew made an immediate correlate to IQ levels. However, what do meta-analytic studies say? Here's the idea. If there is inbreeding, is there going to be genetic problems? Yes, absolutely. In fact, it says here genetic disorders such as hydrocephalus, that's the one Andrew pointed out, neural tube defects and congenital heart defects are more common. In Palestine and Lebanon, there are also very high rates of children born with cleft lips and palates. But here's what it says. One meta-analytic study on the relationship between hydrocephalus and IQ said, the current meta-analysis addressed for the first time the association between shunt revisions and diminished IQ in individuals with CHC through a systematic, quantitative investigation of the current literature. A statistically significant, reliable effect indicated that increased number of shunt revisions is associated with IQ score reductions. What does that mean? Well, if you have this hydrocephalus, you get a tube that has to kind of drain out some of the liquids in your brain. And it says with more and more, the more you have to have that happen, that's what they call shunt revisions. The more you have to have this tube put in, it's actually going to hurt your IQ. Okay, so now we say to ourselves, wow, that's not good. Obviously, people who have this hydrocephalus have a bigger chance of having an IQ issue. But here's what you really need to know. Here's what you really need to know. This is the secret little this is the elephant in the room that was omitted from the study that we just saw from Andrew. Per 100,000 people who have hydrocephalus, the prevalence. Okay, so here's what we see per country. Okay, so per 100,000 people, you can see here a very, very, very low percentage of people. So look at this in different countries. Somewhere between, say, 60 people per 100,000 to 120 people per 100,000. So in other words, for every 100,000 people in these countries, there are very few who have this disease, very few. So only like in some places, maybe 120 people at most in some of these different societies. So 120 out of every 100,000 people, that is not a very high percentage of people. So to generalize and say that because some people who have hydrocephalus also have lower IQs means that the entire country has a lower IQ, that's a little bit flawed. I mean, you can't make that argument. And I'm a fan of Andrew in some ways. I like some of the things Andrew says. I admit I'm a Christian. I tend to be biased for Christianity. But in this case, I want to make sure we're keeping everything fair. Let's keep it fair, friends. Let's keep it fair. So what is IQ and inbreeding? Well, here's a study. I'm going to point out to the results of this. So there was an original study by Woodley in 2009, and it pointed to a rather high relationship between the two measures, which was cousin marriages and IQ, national IQ. However, this particular study by the same author, that's what's interesting, he realized the flaws in his study later and realized he actually needed to include control variables. Remember when we talked about univariate analysis? Once we add in the control variables, okay, that also speak to IQ, you can't just say cousin marriage and IQ, bang, they're correlated. Therefore, this is a relationship we must exploit. No, you have to add in the other controls that are super important. So here's what we found out. Education matters. No duh. You have to include education. So in these countries, as we pointed out, where there tends to be high levels of cousin marriage, there also tends to be lower levels of education. And once we factor in education and also democracy, GDP per capita, and some other factors, we find that these factors all play into a regression equation on the relationship between IQ. Now, what's actually interesting is apparently what they call higher skin reflectance, which means lighter skin related to IQ, and non-communist countries that had similar GDPs also tended to have higher levels of IQ. So there are different factors. I won't get too much into that, but I want to say that Again, I would say a lot of it has to do with encouragement of people in different countries as far as schooling. So 80% of people live in a country where a majority share their religion. So that's something that is to point out. But that also says that there are also people in subgroups that we should account for when we make generalizations saying, okay, in the United States, we have a certain percentage of people who identify as Christians. And within the Christians, we have a certain percentage of people who identify as Catholics and Protestants and all of these other denominations. We have to point out that you can't therefore assume just because X country has a high level of this means that everyone in that country is thinking a certain way, especially in a place like the United States. That's what we would call very heterogeneous, meaning we're a melting pot. We have people from all kinds of cultures all around the world. We also have a really good split between beliefs in, say, the conservative views and the more liberal views. And so you can't generalize from a heterogeneous population to make a statement like people in the United States all tend to be trending liberal. That just isn't the way it works. That just isn't the way it works. You have to actually drill down a little bit, not to look at mean scores at the country level, but to look at individual level data. Again, that's the ecological fallacy. You need to look at the individual level data. One of the things I did when I did pull information from the World Value Surveys is I looked at the individual level rather than looking at mean scores of ethical values across the world. I looked at individual level scores in the United States. So I isolated over a couple thousand people in the United States, and I looked at variations between the generations on whether people would and this again is in Ethics and Behavior 2022, but I looked at whether people would, and younger generations, whether they were more likely to be more tolerant of things like prostitution and homosexuality and abortion and those kind of factors. And yes, I did find significant differences between the generations, between the two youngest generations in that data set, which were the Y generation, the millennials, and the Z generation, and the Generation Xers and the boomers and the silent generation above them. In other words, the older generations, people born before 1980, were much more conservative than the younger generations. And so to that end, Daniel might have a point. Daniel could really drill down on that kind of information. In other words, it also found that the younger generations were more likely to justify cheating on taxes, stealing, not paying a bus fare. They're more likely to justify a number of different things. Now, that bothered me, of course, because I have two sons in that age range. But I also realized that social media probably is a contributor to higher levels of tolerance within groups, within people, between groups within people, I should say. Okay, so here's what we have. Some countries are too heterogeneous in religion to generalize. That's what I would say. And so you can see right here, for example, we have in Asia Pacific, we have, for example, 58% of people in the Asia Pacific are Muslim. You just see variations. Sub-Saharan Africa, we've got different percentages of people. So there's too much of that. Also in the United States, Americans believe in God by religion. And so you can see right here, the net belief in God in the United States says most Americans believe in God. If you're religiously affiliated, 96% of people believe in God, whether absolutely or fairly. And so you can see a pretty high percentage of people. Now, in the United States, about 7% of people are, where do we have here? Is this the United States? 89%? I won't get into this so much. But anyway, so we can see some different factors here of variation within the country. Lots of different belief systems in the United States. And Americans also, you see 57% of U.S. Christians say homosexuality should be accepted by society. 55% of same-sex marriage should be legal. And so you do have some adults saying that. You do see trends rising. You see from 2007, these numbers have increased to 2023. However, that, again, that ignores necessarily the variation within different groups and between different groups. 52% of U.S. Christians say abortion should be legal. In most or all cases, 47% said it should be illegal. And so you can see again here. So we still have a pretty significant percent of Christians who are against mothers who want to take the lives of their babies. And so we see that that's really important. Now, if you do nothing else today, say some prayers for the women who are making the decision to take the life of their baby. Pray that they actually see an ultrasound. Pray that they realize that that little baby inside of them is a gift from God, made in God's image and glory. We also see fertility rates. Now, this is something that Daniel also rightly pointed out, is the idea of fertility rates. And Muslim fertility rates, 3.1, Christians, 2.7, Hindus, 2.4, Jews, 2.3, etc., etc. That is a problem. That is a problem. In the world, we are decreasing in fertility rates. In fact, the richer the country, the lower the fertility rate. And that's all throughout Europe, United States, South Korea, and Japan are particularly problematic. If we stop having babies, we are going to die as a society. And that's why a lot of predictions say that Muslims are going to surpass Christians by 2050 because the fertility rates. They keep having babies. Now, again, we got to drill down to different denominations. Catholics that don't want you to have contraception, Catholics are promoting big families. They believe in this idea of go forth and multiply from God. But some other denominations aren't as much in support of that necessarily. They don't vocalize it. But I think we all need to. If I were to get anything out of this conversation, it's to point to the value of fertility. We need to have more babies. Muslims have figured that out. That's a good point on the Muslim side. Now, here's IQ scores by country. Again, some of the factors that relate to IQ scores. Now, Andrew seemed to make a big deal out of the main factor, according to him, is cousin marriage. But I would say there's quite a few other factors. Even the weather is a factor. Okay, why is the weather a factor? Because of traditional education rates in the northern hemisphere and the far southern hemisphere, in places where it's colder, okay, not around the equator, places where it's colder, people tended to basically go off and educate themselves more. They tended to go to schools more. Universities sprung up in these kind of places. And so there tended to be more of that. And so education levels have varied as a function of that. Also, of course, relative levels of money. So if you have places that are high in gross domestic product, you tended to have people who are more able to be educated. In some parts of the world, people don't realize this, but a lot of the parents, like for example, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, these are such impoverished countries that parents can't afford to put food on the table. And so they not only work themselves, but they need their kids to start working, say at the age of 6. In fact, Pakistan's known for having these little kid carpet makers put carpets together, and their little hands are just doing all that kind of stuff at a very early age. And it's a vicious cycle because they can't get out of it. It's a vicious cycle, meaning that the parents can't afford to have the kids not work. So the kids start, weaving carpets at the age of 6, and then they have kids, and their kids also can't afford, they also need their kids to work at very, very early ages. And so they don't have high education levels. If there's one way to improve the world, it's the higher education levels. Okay, so here's the highest IQ countries. Now, if you were on Daniel's side, you say, oh my gosh, China. China's like 19% claimed Christian. China's very low percentage of people who admit the fact that they believe in Christianity or any other faith. You probably know that 1.8 million ethnic Uyghurs who are Muslims have been imprisoned, basically put into a concentration camp in China. That's the kind of environment you have in a communist country like China. It tends to be high levels of atheism. A lot of people who are religious are squashed and discriminated against. It's a horrible environment. It's got Big Brother watching you all day long. Is that what you want? No, none of us want that. I can get together with both Andrew and Daniel and say we don't want that for a society. We don't want this whole idea of Big Brother watching and giving you social credit scores. We don't want any of that. But it has a very high IQ because people realize in those countries the only way out is education. They've got to get educated. And then a lot of them come to our country. They come to different parts of the world and they thrive. They thrive. They do really well in different parts of the world. So Oliver Catwell says several developing countries have relative iodine deficiency without iodinized salt. This leads to higher prevalence of low thyroid levels in pregnant women, which contribute to low IQ. Yeah, Good point. So there are many factors that contribute to a lower IQ. Okay. It could be poor nutrition. That's absolutely a factor. Poor nutrition, we see that in a lot of countries in Africa. We talk about the sub-Saharan African region. A lot of people are impoverished, and the nutrition doesn't consist of enough of the vitamins that we need and the minerals that we need to survive. And so there's so many factors that impact IQ. And I would say, like in some of these places, people's will to succeed is driven by the fact that they're surrounded by a very repressive country that suppresses free speech. And places like China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, people might want to be freed of some of the repression that they have. And so they are very likely to try to succeed educationally. The beauty of coming to places like the United States is once you get here, it's so easy to start a business. It's so easy. In fact, that even also distinguishes us from Europe, where it's much more difficult to start a business in many places. It's very easy to start a business. It's about $100 here in Florida if you want to go get incorporated in the state of Florida, get your sales tax information and get going. I've done it several times. Not hard at all. Not hard at all. And so you can start a business, you can succeed, you can go from rags to riches in places like the United States. And that's one of the reasons with our going back to some of the views that we have over here in the United States, and some of the highlights of having Western values are what they called, Max Weber coined in the last century, the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. We have free markets. We can make money. We can speak out against our leaders. We have a very good deal here. So yeah, rebuke and reprove says Christianity reigns supreme. There's lots of advantages to being a Christian. One is you're following the truth and the truth will set you free. Jesus is the truth. He's the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father but through the Son. And so please, people, if you, there's been a resurgence of people in Muslim countries who are having dreams of Jesus. Jesus is appearing. In fact, I saw one of the debaters on the Modern Day Debate channel. He said that he had a dream of Jesus. That's amazing. But he doesn't realize that Jesus is Lord. He thinks that Jesus is maybe a great prophet who's going to return and save the world. Jesus is Lord. He's Lord. He's part of the triune Lord. And so countries with the highest religiously unaffiliated, okay, so China is home to 67% of the world's unaffiliated people. Look at China. It's got almost 1.3 billion people. Japan, you see these different countries right here of religiously unaffiliated. Now, a lot of them, again, tend to be leaning towards the atheist. In fact, places even like Germany in Europe, it's one of the more atheistic countries. And so you have the unaffiliated, and that's something that has trended. That's a truth. That's something that Daniel pointed out that is true. So here's some other factors that impact IQ. Education, like Oliver pointed out. Nutrition, that's what Oliver pointed out. Environment, education-focused culture, studying. Studies have shown that training your brain can increase your IQ. In other words, studying's really good for you. IQ is partially inherited from your parents, as is portions of your personality. Like if you're conscientious, you probably have a parent who's conscientious, and conscientiousness is a correlate of IQ. Having high levels of hard work ethic and the drive to succeed and diligence, those are part of conscientiousness, and those also relate to IQ. One thing that Daniel pointed out, he kept talking about the Flynn effect. So what is a Flynn effect? It's basically saying that when you get there's a sustained increase of IQ, when we have a sustained increase in the factors like our economy's improving, the access to education's improving, both females and males are encouraged to be educated. One of the reasons for lower IQs in some of the Muslim countries is because females, half the population, half the IQ score, okay, are not being encouraged to go into education. They're not going into secondary and tertiary education. Secondary is high school, tertiary is college. They're not being promoted. They're not told to go get educated. And when you have half the population not being educated, of course the IQ scores are going to be lower on average. You have to take that into effect. So what else does the Pew Research say? Well, the Pew Research also says that Muslims were the fastest growing religious group over the decade. Daniel's right about that. Look at that number. Also, Christians decreasing by 1.8. That is not good between 2010 and 2020. Muslims increasing by 1.8 percentage points. The religiously unaffiliated, okay, the new atheists started off in this 20 years ago, and unfortunately, that's still lingering. They're still making an impact. The U.S. has the world's largest Christian population. You might want to know that. The largest Christian population. So the U.S. is the third largest country in the world. You've got about 1.3, 1.4 billion people in China and India, in each of those countries. And then United States, about 334 million people. And of those 334 million people, 217 million people, or 64%, are Christians. And that is over a 9% share of the world population in Christians. So there's lots of Christians in the United States, and it has served us really well. Brazil, 108 million Christians in Brazil, about 80% of the country. That's amazing. Okay. Mexico, Philippines, Russia. Who knew? Who knew Russia had such a high percentage? I would have thought Russia was more atheist because of its communist past. However, look at this, 102 million people in Russia. 69.9% are Christian. Nigeria, where Christians unfortunately have been being slaughtered by a lot of Muslims, a lot of radical Muslims over there. 43% of people living in Nigeria are Christians. Pray for those people. It's really important to pray for those people. Countries with the highest Muslim counts. Where are these Muslims in the world? Well, 238 million of them are over in Indonesia. 226 million are in Pakistan. 213 million are in India. Bangladesh, Nigeria. Again, Nigeria, they make up 58%. So Christians are a minority in Nigeria. That's one of the places they're being heavily persecuted. Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Sudan, Algeria. These are all Muslim countries, very high percentage of Muslim people in those countries. And there's that. So what we need to do as Christians in the world is look at the facts around the world, acknowledge that we need to figure out a way for a Christian revival, understand that a lot of Christians are occupying now different parts of the world that tended to be less developed. Like, look, here in sub-Saharan Africa, it surpassed Europe. It's going to be the region where the most Christians live. Christian missionaries like Oliver, he said he was in, if I recall correctly what he said earlier, that he is a missionary. They go to the less developed countries a lot of times. And when people hear about the good news, it gives them so much hope. And what is the good news of Christianity? It is seeking the light and the truth and the love of Jesus Christ. He is the truth. He is the answer. People who have the most difficult time in life. Here's just a little interesting fact. If you look at the Globe study, now the Globe study is of 62 societies all around the world of thousands of people. And they looked at this measure called humane orientation. Now, what is humane orientation? It's the idea of benevolence, being kind to both the in-group and the out-group. Here's what they found. They found people in some of the most challenging environments in the poorest parts of the world, like in Africa, in many countries of Africa, had the highest levels of humane orientation. Ireland, which has a history of place like the potato famine, tons of discrimination coming in. I'm part Irish, part English too. The English were discriminating against the Irish, the Protestants versus the Catholics. We saw some of that stuff. We also saw some Catholics against the Protestants. We saw lots of infighting. But in places that have traditionally suffered, like Ireland actually has a higher level of humane orientation versus, say, places like Germany, West and East Germany had lower levels of humane orientation. So some of the most wealthy, most secular, and highest lifestyle, like, people self-claimed levels of happiness tend to be in places that have lowest levels of humane orientation. These are places where people might not be as likely to take care of their parents. They're more willing to put their parents into homes than to take care of them in their homes when they get older. And so, there's some advantage to actually being in a location where you're suffering. And that speaks to the whole thing of Christianity. Christianity points to how suffering can lead you to the truth. It sounds crazy. That's why Catholics always say, offer it up. If you're suffering, offer it up. You can give your suffering over to the benefit of your friends and your neighbors and people who need to find Jesus. Just to point that out. So I want to conclude with what we found in these debates. Now, Andrew and Daniel Haqiqatjou debated, and Daniel's a Muslim. Andrew is a Christian. Both are from the United States, as far as I know. Both are benefiting from the U.S. society. We're breathing the fumes of the Christian foundations upon which our country has been built. We're benefiting tremendously from the work ethic that we've developed over the years, the idea of free markets. We have the best constitution in the world. We promote human rights and the dignity and life justice for all. In fact, right in our Constitution, it says we're all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here in the United States. These values came from Christianity. Where do you think they came from? They came from Christianity. They came from Jesus. If you go back to Jesus's time historically, you're going to realize that way back when, it said might is right. The strong were the ones who were doing well. It was a shocker that Jesus said the meek will inherit the earth. Nobody could believe that. They were like, what do you mean the meek will inherit the earth? This is crazy. What do you mean the meek will inherit the world? What do you mean the meek will inherit the world? It was crazy. And so what happened was Christians came about, the idea that we were going to help the poor, help the humble, help the meek, and that we were going to create hospitals, education, universities, facilities. And that's one of the reasons why Christians have thrived throughout the world. And that's the reason we need to preserve our Christian culture all around the world. Thankfully, we have the United Nations. Human rights has also declared the intrinsic value of humans. And unfortunately, when we advocate for the right to cut off the most innocent among us, the baby in the womb, that is a violation of the intrinsic human rights that God has given us. Human value is not conferred by other humans. It's conferred by God. It says it right in Genesis 1:26-27. We are made in the image of God. We are God's image bearers. So what we want to do is call out. We want to bring our Muslim friends to the Christian faith. We want to bring our atheist friends to the Christian faith. We want people to realize that when you make arguments against each other in debates, as Andrew and Daniel did here, you don't want to generalize something at the population level, something at the country level, all the way down to individuals within that population. It's not a fair thing to do. You have to actually not commit the ecological fallacy. You want to make sure that you understand that there are numerous factors contributing to the outcomes that you might be pointing out, like Daniel, and pointing to all Christians falling for this very liberal nonsense in some ways. And also with Andrew pointing that just because in some countries there are high levels of cousin marriage, therefore IQ levels also are at lower levels. Now, he didn't even bother to present studies that have shown you a correlation, because the study that I showed you, the meta-analytic study, showed you that there was actually a zero correlation once you control for all these other factors that make a bigger difference in IQ scores. So I hope you had a great time today. I rarely go this long. This is so crazy. I've gone an hour. I am starting a series on, it's going to be with the Dawn Patrol. It's the early morning, Saturday morning risers here in the United States. I started at 7 o'clock. I'm going to do this every weekend because it's the best time for me to get on. I discovered my kids are coming home for the Thanksgiving break. They're going to be home for 5 weeks at Christmas from college. And it's the only time in the house I can probably do this. So I'm going to do it at 7 o'clock in the morning. So tune in every week. The only one with exception might be next week. We might be out of town. If I am out of town, I might try to do something. I might bring my camera and equipment with me over to the other coast of Florida. We will see. So I hope you have a good time today. If you like this kind of content, please share it with your friends. Please like, please comment. Please let me know where you're seeing this from. Please let me know what faith you are. If you're a Muslim, please let me know and let me know what you think of this video. I try to be fair to both sides. Please let me know if you're a Christian or if you're an atheist. I want to know. I would love to hear about your background, where you grew up. I'd love to hear that in the comments. I also would like to hear what country you're from. Where are you hearing me? I have a feeling that this might be playing a little bit more over in the English-speaking areas of Europe right now, because they're right now in the later part of the morning, early part of the afternoon. So anyway, please come again, and I will see you soon. I'm going to start, by the way, also going to do my free-for-alls. I'm probably going to do one this weekend where I open it up to people. I'm probably going to do a free-for-all on the Muslim versus Christian debates, not just the one with Andrew, but also the ones with Apostate Prophet and with Inspiring Philosophy, because I also watched those debates and I found them very interesting. And I'd like to open up a conversation about that in a free-for-all. So it's going to be an open mic for you, be coming soon, definitely on the weekend. And so have a great day. Thank you. Whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for God's glory.